started Parents for a Safer Environment 14 years ago when parents basically witnessed their neighbors spraying near children in the parks and in the schools. And actually, it started in the Moraga Unified School District, where a number of kids ran into the office with asthma, kids who've never had an asthma attack. And they found out that there was just an application that very morning. And that's kind of, but even before that, we were gathering signatures to try to get the school district to adopt an integrated pest management policy, because back then in 2005, it wasn't required. So now, as you probably all know, every school, municipality and school district, public school district in California is required to have a written, what's called the written integrated pest management policy and a program. Moraga Unified School District ended up adopting the most protective integrated pest management policy in Northern California. It's illegal to basically ban pesticides. You can't do that. But you could create a program where you have to try least toxic alternatives first before using the more toxic pesticides. Our mission statement is basically to foster the healthy development of children and to help protect wildlife and the environment by decreasing preventable exposure to toxicants. So we only deal with things where there's alternatives. We don't address things where there's no solutions. So Parents for Safer Environment is a grassroots volunteer group, and it's made up of the director, myself, steering committee, and advisory board members, experts in IPM, in toxicology, cancer research all over Northern California. We've won many awards throughout, in the past 14 years since we've been established, including from the California State Legislature, California State Senate and Assembly for protecting public health and the environment. So this is our current work. We do research, we do education and advocacy. So research includes, looking at pesticide use reports so we partner with the community and they'll say, hey, help us. We're concerned about the pesticides. And so what we do is we take a team and we actually engage students, high school students and college students, and we train them on how to evaluate pest use databases, toxicity databases. And so with students, and they often present as well to the decision makers, we evaluate the toxicity of the pesticides being used at the municipality. And then we also do outreach and education, like what we're doing today, and get experts like Chip Osborne, who we'll introduce in about 30 minutes. And then we also do advocacy work, changing policies so that it protects not just the users, like the kids and the pets, or also the staff, because basically all the research is showing it's the staff who get the highest exposure when applications are done. So we do a lot of literature research and pesticide toxicity analysis. We engage students and do outreach at festivals, as well as doing analytical work. They do a lot of analysis on the computer. And if you have any students at home, they want to, they're really responsible, you could send them our way. We'll interview them and we would consider working with them to give them an internship. We've probably trained over 40 high school and college students, and a couple of them also has won awards from the California State Legislature for protecting public health and the environment. We also do a lot of presentations to service organizations and decision-making bodies. This is 12 years ago. That was one of our largest events. It was packed. 90 people came from, I think, over 50 different municipalities in a room that was a quarter this size, I think. And we were packed in there, but they loved it. And they asked us for more. They filled out an evaluation and they said, we want more trainings like this. We've never had trainings like this before. So right after that, then we started to engage experts. We hired Bill Curry, an expert IPM advisor from Arizona, to do hands-on training with on landscape weed control, because the staff were saying that was one of the biggest challenges, weed control. At our 10th year anniversary just 3 years ago, and so we provided 11 experts from all over California who provided 23 different workshops that were going on simultaneously during the whole day. We also do collaboration with agencies like the Flood Control District of Contra Costa County. We did a pilot trial, hired 400 goats and a herder, and we did a study that was, it's going to be published. And what we found out is that even though the goats, we wanted to see if we could replace herbicide spraying with using goats, and we knew there's going to be a lot of poop in there called fecal coliform, but we wanted to see how much of it goes downstream, because the State Water Resources Board, they're really more concerned about how much fecal coliform and contamination is coming downstream into the bay. Well, to our amazement, even though if you see over there, there's goats inside the water and pooping in there, to our amazement, 100 feet down, there were no fecal coliform compared to the control upstream where the goats didn't graze. So the county repeated this study, but our study, we were very frugal. We did it under $8,000. We had a lot of free data analysis done by a local sewage company, but the counties, I think they spent $150,000 to do a 3-year study with goats and sheep. They got the same results. They did it in Walnut Creek. And over 3 years, they said, wow, we also can't, there's no contamination using goats. So whether it's erosion or fecal coliform, they did not contaminate the water. So now the county is now slowly changing over the herbicides with goat grazing right on the water, which we looked for 3 or 4 years in the literature, and nobody has done this kind of research. This is the first of its kind. We've also done advocacy work, of course. That's the third leg of our work. And this is an example of what we do. We review documents, we give public comments, and we encourage, basically not just having a written IPM policy that's required of everybody, but actually implementing these toxic alternatives and trying the alternatives that is working in many other municipalities. And finally, we also have done legislative work. You've heard of the Healthy Schools Act, the amendment. Well, I call this David versus Goliath, because David Tierling was a 12-year-old from a school in San Francisco, and we had zero budget, like literally not even $1. It was all done by volunteer work, me and students. He was the youngest. I had high school students do a lot of data analysis, and we had a lot of friends. My background's, I have a public health degree from UC Berkeley. I have a lot of contacts with PhDs and MDs, and so we engaged them, and we are the ones who testified in front of the legislature, and we made the pesticide industry really look very inconsistent with their claims. And so we got our bill, the Healthy Schools Act amendment, passed both houses. Both the House and the Senate, and people, not the House, the Assembly and the Senate, people said it was like a miracle. It hasn't ever happened. But of course, at that time, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, he was in the pockets of the Clorox company who fought against this bill. And so if Governor had signed it, it would have basically restricted all the bad actor pesticides. And I won't go into it in detail, but it's like the most toxic pesticides that is known to cause brain damage, known to cause cancer, known to cause birth defects. So, he said, no, I'm going to protect the industry. So we had to go back, and now a law finally passed in 2014, and that was a diluted version of what we wanted, and it's more of a right to know, more transparency and training. The 1-hour training minimum required for school IPM, and then having an IPM policy at the school district sites, and then the third one is providing the pesticide use reports to the state or the local Department of Ag. That's all it was. It was more of a, transparency law. And it got really watered down, and that's what happens often, unfortunately. So we just talked about that, and many school districts are not aware that actually even though they do not have to report if they have a contractor using pesticides, school districts do not need to report what the contractors are using to the state. The contractors have to do that themselves to a separate school IPM department. And however, the school is required to retain those records at site for 4 years, even though the contractor sprayed. So that's one point that many school districts seem to not understand very clearly. Pesticides, some people equate that with insecticide, but actually, most of you know, right, that it's a compound, a substance that's been created to control or minimize a number of pests, any kind of pests. So it could, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, and microcides even are pesticides because they're registered as a pesticide. Like, remember the antimicrobial product, the antimicrobial soaps? The FDA has now banned triclosan from going into those antibacterials. So right now, what's legal to do is use it in the stockpile, but if you want to take care of yourself, of course, it's best to not order any stockpiled material because they're not manufacturing it anymore. Because studies have shown people who, when they compared people who use antibacterial soap to ones that just regular soap and water, there was no difference in how much bacteria grew on their hand after they pressed it onto this plate that grows bacterial colonies. And on the other hand, there's all these toxic chemicals like dioxin that piggybacks with triclosan. So it really is and they said FDA have decided that there's no benefit to antibacterial soap. But in integrated pest management, we do not address cleaning products like antibacterial soaps or like triclosan or bleach, like sodium hypochlorite, the household bleach, although it's registered pesticide. That's in integrated pest management, we're only dealing with landscape and structural pest control methods, pest control issues. So really quickly, what's in a pesticide? So you guys know about the active ingredients, right? That's what's listed on the pesticide product label. But there's also you've heard of inert ingredients? Well, inert ingredients means that there's no toxicity associated, it's safe. Well, actually that's not the case. We one time in one of our workshops had a US EPA representative present, and he said even on their website it says inert ingredients can be more toxic and more so than active ingredients to a non-target organism. Like case in point, I mean, how many of you guys use Roundup? I have to admit, I've used Roundup for many years before I found out that it might be harmful. So when I used to live in Richmond, and our family, there was bamboo all over the backyard, so we used Roundup quite a bit. Unfortunately, both of my dogs got cancer, but we don't know if it was because of the Roundup. But what I do as a scientist, I tend to depend on the peer-reviewed published literature. I don't go by what I find on the internet and some arbitrary organization who, I don't have any idea what their background is and what kind of, credibility they have. So we only go by peer-reviewed published science. And so I wasn't that worried about Roundup because at that time when I was using Roundup in this was around when my son was born, 1999, the consensus, there was no main regulatory body that came out and said Roundup is, of concern. It was more like, well, it's the active ingredient glyphosate. We can't really come to a conclusion that, there's really, significant risk with glyphosate. Now, so glyphosate by itself, a lot of the studies, even now, shows that glyphosate, by itself, when you administer it to a laboratory animal, you don't really see significant harm with glyphosate. But when you use the whole product, yeah, you do. But most of the studies, the way it's done in the United States, we focus on the active ingredient. That's how it's done, not the whole product. Those studies are very rare. So when you look at the studies on the whole product, now we're seeing problems. We're seeing problems in laboratory animals and human tissue culture cells. And what we're finding out is that there's a synergistic effect when there's other chemicals, such as adjuvants. You guys heard of adjuvants? It's like surfactant soap that help deliver the chemical, or it helps penetrate the membranes. And so what we're finding out is that a lot of this has to do with exposure, and exposure at the cellular level. And so when you use the whole product, it's really different than the studies where they just looked at glyphosate. Those are kind of meaningless. And also, we have to remember, when studies are done, you take the lab animals, and the typical study, I would say 99% of the studies are where the animals, lab animals, get exposed to one chemical, just glyphosate. That's the studies on glyphosate. But what happens, now this lab animal is being exposed to one chemical, and it's in a very controlled environment. It's not being exposed to, let's say, flame retardant chemicals, to perfluorocarbon chemicals. We are, in our bodies, according to the Center for Disease Control, we have over 100 different chemicals in our bodies, every one of us. Actually, it's like several hundred is the average. So our exposure to chemicals is very different than a laboratory rat. When you're testing in a laboratory setting, they're being exposed to one chemical at a time. What we're finding, what it's called, is the cumulative effect. When you expose an animal, like humans, to several chemicals at a time, it's a whole different ball game. So now scientists are, about 15 years ago, they started to do these studies where now they're administering several chemicals at a time. So not just one active ingredient. Now they're putting in the adjuvant, and now they're also exposing them to a fungicide. And then they started to see effect. Now that's really representative of what happens in real life. We're not exposed to one chemical at a time. That is not real. What's real is that we're exposed to hundreds of chemicals at any given time. So the take-home message is this, that even though you see only the active ingredients on the label, the inactive ingredient could actually be more toxic. The adjuvant in Roundup, for example, it's called POEA. It actually is, it by itself is damaging to fetal tissue culture cells. And whereas glyphosate doesn't do anything to fetal tissue culture cells. Of course, the target for Roundup is weeds, not humans, right? So the case in point is that inactive ingredients, especially targeted for another organism, could be more harmful to a different species. So what's on a pesticide label? So you guys probably know this pretty well, so we go through it really quick. Of course, the name of the product, the intended use, target species, dosage rate. But here's why I want to show you this. There is, how many of you are aware of the signal word? Have you ever gotten a training that you have to look for the signal word? How many of you have looked for a signal word on a packaging? Okay. So how many of you have heard that, well, the signal word is either danger, warning, or caution. And if it's caution, then it's safe. You don't have to worry about it. You may not even have to wear gloves and personal protective equipment because it's kind of, mild. Well, you got to, if you don't remember anything else from today's event, at least my portion, remember this. That signal word only refers to acute toxicity. Okay, could I see a raise of hands? How many of you have gone to a training where they talked about the difference between acute toxicity, where you get exposed to a chemical and you react immediately, like within a second, within a few seconds, within a few minutes, maybe up to a few days. So that's more like acute toxicity. You could link your reaction, symptoms, to perhaps an exposure, a cause. That's acute toxicity. remember, when you see that signal word, that is only related to immediate health effects. So the take-home message is this. On a pesticide label on a product, when you look at that, you're going to look at the signal word. You cannot assume that, you cannot assess whether that product is safe or not. Because sometimes we kind of think of it that way, blanket safe or not. You cannot assess the degree of safety looking at the signal word, except for acute toxicity, immediate effects. Okay? It says nothing about chronic effects, and almost most pesticide products do not provide chronic effects because it's not a requirement. So in 2005, the California Department of Public Health, they're one of the ones that gave us a grant award to do some research. They say these are the major health risks. And as you go up here, there's more epidemiological evidence, which means large groups of human studies. So down here, you have fewer human studies. It's more anecdotal human, concerns, people going into the doctors and so forth. But as you go up higher, much more studies. This is just maybe animal studies. But as you go up here, much more. And so it's been established that there are major health risks, chronic health risks. And let's talk about what that means in a second. So the most vulnerable population are, as you probably have heard, is the fetus, the infants and children, elderly, and those with compromised immune system, and those with allergies or sensitivity to chemicals. Why is that? That indicates that there's something wrong with their barrier, whether it's intestinal or on your skin. It's basically, I won't get into the details of it, but basically it's called leaky. You have a leaky membrane, and you're more susceptible to having symptoms when being exposed to chemicals. Those undergoing chemotherapy or taking immune suppressed drugs as well. So, some of you here are probably still at childbearing age. Basically, what the studies are showing, even 1 year prior to conception, the mother is susceptible, the baby could have a damage if the mother is exposed to cigarette smoking, alcohol, and any other chemicals. But those are the chemicals that have been studied the most, alcohol and cigarette smoke. So, and what's interesting is that when we find that the babies that have damage when they're born, like their response is slow, they have a smaller birth weight, their head circumference is smaller, these are the same babies that grow up to be children that tend to have attention deficit order, learning disabilities, asthma, maybe even autism. So we're seeing this trend in public health. So when the baby is born with problems, health problems, they tend to become children who also have more problems. And then as the children grow, these children with attention deficit order and autism grow up, they tend to be the adults who have higher risk to cardiovascular disease, and then diabetes, and the same adults who have these health problems, these common health problems like hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, then they become the elderly people who have a higher risk of dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease. So protecting the fetus is extremely important. Protecting the pregnant mother is very important. That's one of the reasons why many community groups like Parents for a Safer Environment are so concerned about pesticide spraying in the parks, because I'm going to show you in a few minutes, there's so much evidence that these pesticides are getting into our bodies. So right now, the health statistics very quickly. Asthma is up 160% in the past 20 years. In fact, there's also a study in the package, you can look at it later. It shows how herbicides in particular, are linked to asthma, especially the younger the child is when they're exposed to herbicides, the much more likelihood of them getting chronic asthma. Cancers are up in children in the past 40 years. Even though it declined, it's actually leveled off in the last few years. Really, we're happy about that. That's probably because of all the interventions in the United States to reveal the carcinogens and then to encourage replacement with alternatives to not just the pesticide industry, but all industry across the board. In adults, what we're seeing is an escalation of autoimmune disease. I actually do not know one family that has not that does not know somebody with an autoimmune disease. And autoimmune disease, as you may know, includes arthritis. It's your body attacking itself. Your body is basically recognizing substances in yourself that it shouldn't be attacking. So it's haywire. Your body's going haywire. Like even rheumatoid, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, psoriasis, that's all autoimmune disease, skyrocketing, especially in women in the United States. The statistics is the same in Contra Costa County. The American Cancer Society says there's 80% increase in non-Hodgkin lymphoma in the United States. And the same statistics we see in Contra Costa County, non-Hodgkin lymphoma. That is linked to 2,4-D, exposure to 2,4-D. We're finding high levels in men who use 2,4-D at the rate of 20 times more after application. That's 2,000% increase. It's all in peer-reviewed and published literature. And I actually, if you want that study, email me, and I'll send it to you. And also, that's really interesting that the American Cancer Society says that less than 10% of cancers are linked to genetic dispositions. Less than 10% is due to genetics. But more than 50% is from environmental causes. That's what the American Cancer Society published 5 years ago. In California alone, in 2014, there were 156,000 cases just in California of cancer. What's really sad is that right now, 1 out of 3 of us are getting cancer before we die, 1 out of 3. If you go, well, you say, well, maybe, that's because we're living longer. Well, look at some countries where they're not industrialized. It's not like that at all. They don't get the cancers we do. So something is very different. But then when people from other countries that are not industrialized end up in the United States, in 1 generation, their family also get the same type of cancer that we do living in the United States. So right now, the women cancer rate is about 34%. 1 out of 3 women are getting cancer before they die. Men is even higher. It's like 42%. Almost 1 out of 2 men are getting cancer in this country. And that's the same statistics in Contra Costa County. So we don't know exactly why. We don't know exactly why, but there are a lot of research pointing to many factors that contribute to cancer. And pesticide is one of many. And it's where we could make a difference. Because there's things that we can't control, like UV radiation. Yeah, you could try to wear a hat, but you can't stop the sun from shining. Actually, with with greenhouse gases to some degree, that's happening at a molecular level. But there's certain things we can't control as much. But with pesticides, we have found that there are alternatives, and many municipal public agencies are going to those alternatives to protect their staff. Because once staff get sick, and they become disabled. I mean, that's really expensive for society as well. There's a lot of variability among people. There could be as much as 50 times variability. That's 5,000% difference between you and me. We could have. It's the level of some enzymes. There's some enzymes in our liver that can help break down pesticides. And those enzyme levels vary quite a bit from person to person. And so what the researchers are finding out, wow, even with an infant, when you compare a baby to its parent, they're finding as much as 150 times difference in the ability to break down pesticides. So it's very important to protect the fetus. The infant and the fetus is even more susceptible. And then, of course, your enzymes are not developed until all your enzymes are for your liver that helps break down pesticides and get rid of toxins in your body are not all there until you're about 8 years old. Have you guys ever heard of the adage, dose makes the poison? Like, everything is dangerous as long as, if you eat as much of it, it could kill you. Well, I kind of tend to agree with that part. Even water, drinking enough water could kill you. Salt, if you eat even, I think 4 or 8 tablespoons of salt could kill an infant. Salt is extremely toxic, but that's acute toxicity, right? When you get exposed to something and and you die immediately, that's acute. But chronic toxicity is when you get exposed to very small amounts of something over a long period of time. That's chronic toxicity. So now, what century is it? 21st century? You know who came up with that adage, dose makes the poison? It was a physician back in the 15th century. Now, that was quite a long time ago, and to me it's amazing that the pesticide industry still quotes a 15th century physician. How much research has been done? I know research is kind of slow and regulations are even slower. It takes about 30 years for regulations to catch up with research because there's a lot of fighting and bickering, right? Industries fighting against public health groups like ours, and so before the regulations become law, there might be 30 years, 20, 30-year lapse, and then those people are guinea pigs. So what we know now in the 21st century is that there's 3 categories of chemicals, including pesticides, that do not fall into this. Dose makes the poison is only for acute toxins. Okay? These are toxins that are not known to cause chronic toxicity, like damage long-term. It could hurt you short-term, like salt. Salt, everybody needs salt. If you don't have salt, you'll die in two weeks. If you don't have sodium in your body, you will die. That's how important salt is to maintain normal functioning of your body. So hormone disruptors, reproductive toxins, and carcinogens, cancer-causing agents. We don't know any level that is safe, according to the research. Okay, so now do you see that this issue is, the dose makes the poison is accurate for only acutely toxic chemicals. But for those that are not acutely toxic, for example, Roundup is one good example. It takes, I think, there were some incidences where I think in India and Japan, people committed suicide drinking 4 pints, I think it took, before it would kill them. So it's not very acutely toxic. Compared to salt, I mean, I think you'd probably die if you drank, like weight-wise, 1/10 of that, you'd be dead. So this notion is that what we need to disband is dose makes the poison. Okay, hormone disruptors. The first handout to your right in your folder, it basically is sort of a comment by Dr. Vandenberg of Tufts University. And she's basically saying there's hundreds of studies that have been found that low levels of hormone-altering compounds are linked to infertility, cardiovascular disease, obesity, abnormal bone health, and cancer. And basically she's saying quote, there are no safe levels for exposure to endocrine disruptors. These are hormones. About 1/3 of the pesticides I've seen at schools and at municipalities, many of the ones that you guys actually work at, are hormone disruptors, about 1/3 of them, from what I've seen. And so we talked about the cumulative effect of pesticides, where when we see pesticide exposure to several chemicals at a time, not just one, we see a synergistic effect, where you see toxic effect when you have multiple chemicals exposure, or even across time, one chemical exposure, but then another one exposed maybe months later to a rat, and then that actually is cumulative as well. And also, what we found is with other risk factors, UV light, stress, lack of sleep, all those things accumulate to decrease your immune system and make you more vulnerable to toxic exposures. Okay, this spin number 2. The LD50s, lethal dose in which 50% of the animals die. Have you ever been shown an LD50 chart and say, hey, look, salt, aspirin, and caffeine. It's got lower LD50. That means it takes less to kill these laboratory animals than the pesticides we're using. So they show you an LD50 chart, but they don't mention that LD50 refers only to death. Lethal dose in which 50% of the animals die. That's acute toxicity. So we're not concerned about that. Pesticide manufacturers don't want to kill us because then they can't sell their product. They don't want to kill us right away because then we'll know. I mean, if you're exposing people to pesticides and they know immediately it's from that, then they're not going to be selling the pesticides, right? They're not going to make any money. So, but the chronic toxicity, it's very hard to link any kind of health effects that occur decades later, maybe even weeks later, to exposure from a pesticide. So sometimes you see this chart, sometimes you see another graph one. This is a bar graph. Sometimes you see a different type of graph, but it all points to the fact they're saying, hey, look, aspirin, salt, and even caffeine is way up there. It takes less of that to kill the animals, but it doesn't, we're not concerned about that, I mean, that's acute toxicity. We're concerned about chronic toxicity. So when they show you the LD50 chart, basically, that's not a little bit, it's quite a bit disingenuous to compare acute toxicity. We're concerned about chronic toxicity. So this is basically, irrelevant. Now the third spin that we've heard was, well, how about the Proposition 65 chemicals? Because I know many of you guys here are using Proposition 65 chemicals that are known to cause cancer, known to cause birth defects, and sometimes the message from your pesticide salesperson is, you know what? Everything causes cancer. Look at this Prop 65 list. Let me show you. Sawdust is on there. Milled flour is on there. So what the heck? Don't bother me about the pesticides, right? Okay, so what would you say? Could somebody tell me a response after what we've been talking about? All right. So what about this? Well, why is sawdust on there? What's that guy doing right now? What's that guy doing? He's got a respirator on, right? Same thing with this guy who's manufacturing flour. He's got a respirator. Why didn't they have respirators? It's because the reason why they're on the Prop 65 list is because they're carcinogens to the lungs due to the small particulate matter. So yes, they are on the Prop 65 list. If you were to eat it, sawdust or flour, it's harmless, right? But if you breathe it in an occupational setting, you could get cancer. That's what we're finding out. So, it's sort of like, do you want to expose yourself or the children to particulate matter that are microscopically small? Is that any better than getting lung cancer? Is that any better than getting cancer in a different way? Or birth defect through a chemical? No. So again, this is the third spin that I wanted to introduce you. When they say, look, Proposition 65 list, it has flour, it's got sawdust in there. Yes, they are very dangerous, and I would not want you guys to go into these facilities without a respirator. Children whose families use pesticides have a much higher rate of many different types of cancers. And there's many studies showing that. The Center for Disease Control, they take blood samples and urine samples. In fact, if any of you guys want to volunteer, I have connections with the state of California that helps administer these testing. We would love to do these studies to see what we find in the bodies of staff who use pesticides, as well as children who play in parks where there's no pesticide spraying, like in the town of Moraga, or where there are pesticide spraying. There's an average of 13 pesticides found on average. Every single person had pesticides in their body. Every single one of us has pesticides in our body. even people who never use pesticides in their life, because it's in the dust. 2,4-D, for example, was found in 20% of those people tested, even people who have never ever used 2,4-D. They're bringing it in from somewhere else, not necessarily from their home. Unfortunately, children sometimes have the highest levels of pesticides, sometimes twice as high or 200% higher. Why is that? It's because of the way children play. They play on the ground, you know, like especially boys, those are the boys 2 times higher than adults. Because boys play kind of grungy, you know, if those of you who had sons, they tend to play, you know, at least my son did. He didn't play in this play structure. He would go and play in the bushes and climb, you know, just climb everywhere. And so sometimes that's where pesticides being sprayed. And so they also put their hands in their mouth. They don't wash their hands before they eat. They pick their nose, rub their eyes. So that's how they get exposed. And so children, because of their behavior, and then also the way they play, and then finally because of their physiology, their enzymes are not as developed, and they don't break down the chemicals as readily as adults. So, and then again, the applicators, they found that they had high spikes in the body, 25 times higher. That's 2,500% higher levels of 2,4-D right after they sprayed. And so this data is all in the Center for Disease Control database online. I'm not going to mention which municipality did this, spraying pesticides right under picnic tables, but this is pretty common, unfortunately. This was Surfland, and how many of you guys use Surfland? It's okay. I mean, I'd say half of the municipalities I've seen use Surfland. Well, Surfland is, the active ingredient is oryzolin. It's a no human carcinogen, and it's a hormone disruptor according to the European Union. And there is, and also it is on the pesticide injunction list. So you may want to note that there's a law that passed in 2012, and a lot of municipalities, they don't know about this. You are required before, basically, it is illegal to use, there's a list of 77 pesticides, including oryzolin and glyphosate and a whole bunch of others. There's like about 66, where if you use any of those chemicals within a certain distance of the habitat of endangered or protected species, it's illegal. But most municipalities do not know about this. But it is a relatively new law. So, you know, speed zone, probably half of you, at least half, maybe 75% of you guys use speed zone. Raise your hand if you use speed zone. Okay, so speed zone and Trimec, it's almost the same thing. Speed zone has just one more ingredient. And 2,4-D dicamba and MCPP, or mecocrop. So this, I'm just going to leave you at this. 2,4-D is a known developmental toxin. It's a hormone disruptor. It's a possible human carcinogen and a potential groundwater contaminant. It also lowers the blood-brain barrier. It allows basically neurotoxic chemicals that cause brain damage to enter into your brain. Normally, if we're not exposed to 2,4-D and other chemicals like this, our body tries to protect itself from brain damage. But with 2,4-D, it will allow these chemicals to enter our brain. So these studies are all peer-reviewed and published and done. And so this is what we're using, Speed Zone and Trimec. And Chip is going to talk now about how we could basically preclude the use of these chemicals by very feasible steps that are being utilized now by many municipalities and in a very successful manner. So I think we're going to stop it there. This just goes over again the danger of 2,4-D. And I do have some, and also how it's being found in every major water body in the United States is contaminated with 2,4-D. And something like 99% of all our fish are being found. Almost all the fish that have been tested by the United States Geological Survey have been found with pesticides in their body. So it's kind of sad that it's just not staying put. You guys ever hear of how 2,4-D gets trapped really easily when you, it doesn't stay in the substrate where you spray because it's got a very low absorption coefficient. 2,4-D, it does not stick to where you spray. It gets on your shoes, it gets in your car. That means it gets into your house if you don't take off your shoes. It's in your dust. And 2,4-D is one of the most dangerous pesticides, includes herbicide, of course. And many countries actually have banned 2,4-D. There's about 4 countries that have banned it, including Denmark. So this just shows you that 2,4-D is being found in people's dust. 63% of households in 2003 had, they've never used 2,4-D. Didn't even know what it was, but when they were tested, 63% of the households have it. So it's moving around in the dust, it's in the air. Okay, so I am going to close. And thank you so much for your attention.